"This shouldn't be happening," Sophie whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, brittle as the paper gown rustling around her shoulders. The phrase hung in the bright, air-conditioned room like a sound that didn't belong there. It had nothing to do with charts or appointments. It had everything to do with the hollow feeling in her chest, an ache that made the air too sharp. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. She hadn't meant to let anyone hear the small, humiliating truth that had been sweating in her veins all morning. That she felt unworthy of attention, that she feared pity more than loneliness, that she had never been the sort of person who could be saved by kindness. Dr. Daniel Hayes saw the tremor in her hands before he heard the rest. He was not supposed to see anything beyond what any good physician noticed: pulse, color, a patient's anxieties folded into clinical notes. He was the chief doctor of Hayes Medical Group, a fact printed on his card and whispered in the hospital corridors. A man who moved with the quiet certainty of someone used to being looked to rather than looked at. He had the jaw and the posture and the expensive restraint of someone whose face stored its emotions behind well-trained muscles. But he was looking now, and what he saw was small and human and broke something in him the way a small, clean thing can shatter a carefully arranged room. Sophie's fingertips were raw at the nails from worry. Her thumb rubbed a groove in the paper gown. Her voice, when it came again, was almost swallowed by the sterile white. I'm sorry," she added, because saying sorry was a reflex she had been practicing since childhood. "I know this is ridiculous." "It isn't ridiculous," he said, softer than he intended. He could have replaced the words with medical platitudes. He could have written them off to anxiety. He could have explained that many people felt the same way in a place like this. Instead, he leaned just a fraction and listened. There is a moment in hospitals that always belongs to the patient. Lights are bright, voices are careful, everything is honest because there is nowhere to hide. Sophie felt exposed in the way people do when an inner map is unfolded and everyone in the room can read the landmarks. Dr. Hayes saw the exact place where shame and hope intersected on her face. He noticed the set of her shoulders that said she had been trained to carry herself small. He noticed how she flinched when he reached for a chart. He did not pity her in the way she feared. He felt instead a tug of recognition, of someone who had learned to brace and never ask to be steadied. He felt something like a promise, which scared him more than most things. "You don't have to apologize for how you feel," he said. His voice was careful, the sort of voice people used when they were negotiating truth, not here. Sophie's laugh was a sharp little thing that bordered on a sob.
"You don't know what it's like," she managed, "to be looked at like someone with a checklist, like charity." He did not look away. He could have chosen the professional distance that came with his rank, the quiet maneuver of a man used to keeping relationships tidy on paper. He could have placed his hand on the desk and stepped backward. Instead, he did what any decent person would do in private. He listened. He took in the small admissions she pushed toward him like fragile paper boats. "I don't want pity," she said finally. I don't want to be the story where a rich man fixes what's broken." It was a blunt sentence, and in it was every fear she'd ever had about being seen through the wrong light. In the way the world tilted around those 4 words, there was an acute brightness, the possibility that someone might mistake generosity for entitlement, that kindness might be misread as power. Daniel's hands, professional and steady, rested on the chart for a moment too long. He was careful now, as always, to keep his face a neutral map. But his chest tightened. The boy he'd been, the one who'd learned to keep love transactional so nothing could cut too deep, recognized the rhythm of a woman trying to shrink away from being owned. "This isn't about having money or not," he answered, choosing words like medicine. "It's about care. He stopped. The admissions of his own life were dangerous things to say in a room that was supposed to be for her. He had practiced neutrality for years because neutrality kept things safe and unasked for and uncomplicated. Except that safety had started to feel like a cage. Sophie's eyes met his for the first time without flinching. They were afraid eyes, green, rimmed with gold flecks, guarded by lashes that blinked too fast. There was a small honesty there, raw and electricity quick, that made Daniel feel absurdly protective. "Then don't give me pity," she said. "Give me nothing if you must. Just don't look at me like I'm an object lesson." He heard the plea behind it. Don't ever make me the example in someone else's story. He promised, without making a dramatic vow, that he would not make her a lesson. He did not know yet how to keep that promise, but the intention settled between them like a clean thing. They finished the consultation with the same careful professionalism with which it had begun. He gave the necessary instructions, asked the necessary questions, all the while aware that their exchange had been a small exception from the script. He watched her gather her things with the reverence people afford when they are trying not to be seen unraveling. As she left, she paused at the door. For a beat, Sophie looked back, the paper gown still whispering around her limbs. She mouthed something that might have been a thank you, might have been guilt, might have been an apology she could not find words for.
Daniel shut the door quietly and made a note on his tablet, the neat handwriting the only record of his attention. He told himself it was simply part of his job. Outside, in the fluorescent inhale of the waiting room, reality resumed. The rustle of magazines, the low murmur of other people's lives, the ticking clock. Sophie sat in a plastic chair with a book balanced on her knees, the kind of book whose pages you skim when you are trying to calm a heart that wants to bolt. She kept one hand in her bag, touching a forgotten packet of gum like a talisman. Her world was small. It had to be small. If she allowed it to spread, it would remind her of everything she lacked. She worked at a second-hand bookstore downtown, a snug place where the air always smelled faintly of dust and old coffee and paper glue. The job was perfect for someone who wanted to witness life from the edges, quiet, orderly, with people moving through like characters in a novel that wasn't asking anything of her. She could stock shelves and restock herself, and the weight of being judged would thin to a manageable hum. When she stepped back onto the sidewalk, sunlight hit her with the bluntness of a truth. New York smelled of exhaust and pretzel carts and the metallic tang of urgency. Sophie hugged her coat tighter and hurried toward the subway, convincing herself she had done the sensible thing. She had faced one fear and left. She did not expect to see him again. The first time he showed up outside the clinic after that day, she was crossing the street, a bag of unpaid library copies clutched awkwardly by her side. He hadn't followed her. He simply emerged from the revolving door as she did, a careful distance between them. It felt like a stage direction, too bold to be coincidence, but not so intrusive as to be threatening. She froze. Her heart tripped. The city became full of a chorus of small noises, the bark of a delivery truck, the low thrum of a bus, the distant shout of someone arguing about rent. Daniel saw the way she hesitated, the tiny hitch of the shoulders that said she was considering retreat, and he did the gentlest thing in the world. He offered a smile that had no obligations attached to it. "Miss Bennett?" he asked, and there was surprise etched into his voice, the kind that implied he recognized her beyond a chart. He felt ridiculous for letting a stranger's tremor catch him, but he had not known he could be caught like that until it happened. "You," Sophie swallowed. "You're everywhere." He laughed softly. "I have an office here." She wanted to tell him to stop making him miraculous. She wanted to say she didn't like being observed the way a specimen is observed under glass. But she also noticed, immediately, that he was precisely as composed as he'd been in the clinic, and exactly as approachable. There was no camera crew, no brass band. The difference between him and the men she imagined in glossy magazines wasn't only money or status.
It was restraint, an ability to be nearby without engulfing. "Right," she said, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't sound like either flattery or accusation. She pulled her coat tighter and started to move. "Look," he hesitated, taking a step that respected more distance than curiosity might have asked of him. "If you ever need to talk without me putting on a doctor's hat, there's a cafe 2 blocks from here. He stopped himself, the sentence trailing. Sometimes the wealth he carried like an inconvenient weather system made things brittle. He didn't want to shine that detail on someone who already feared it. She bristled at the unspoken name of his money. She had always been quick to hate people who used wealth as a doorway into other people's lives. It was a reflex, the kind that kept her hands clean of favors and complicated entanglements. Yet his invitation landed like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples she had to notice. "I don't do coffee with doctors," she said, the words meant to be sharp enough to close the door. He smiled, but there was no offense in it. If anything, his face registered relief, an understanding that her refusal was an honest boundary, not a test to be manipulated. "Then perhaps books," he said. "I'm often at the Helmsley on Saturdays. It's quiet." She wanted to say no and keep her world neat. Instead, she muttered, "Maybe." "Maybe is good," he said. "That's progress." She walked away thinking about how the man at the clinic had reduced the human need to the simplest truth. People wanted to be seen without being fixed. She did not expect him to be capable of gentle restraint. It unsettled her, and she hated that it did. For the next few weeks, their encounters were small and unthreatening, like the careful layering of a scarf on a cold morning. Sometimes he would be standing in the doorway of the bookstore, his frame familiar against the backdrop of neon lights and musty novel spines. He never bought the expensive editions. He wandered through the shelves with a hand brushing over spines like fingers over a piano. Sometimes he would be on the other side of the cafe, sipping black coffee and reading a weathered paperback. These were not strategic appearances. At least Sophie tried to tell herself they weren't. They were possible overlaps in a city of intersecting orbits. Still, his presence had weight. It felt like someone else had noticed the small margin of her life and gently decided to spend time there. She began to let down the tiniest of guards. There was a laugh, surprising in its genuineness, when he recommended a book with an absurdly long subtitle. There were conversations about trivial things, the best bakery on a side street, whether the bookstore should reorder a forgotten poetry section. He asked about the smell of the shop once, as if he hadn't noticed how the air seemed to settle people into another time. He was careful in a way that made care itself possible.
He listened when she talked about little, ordinary injustices, the way a regular customer always tried to return books past their due date, the small kindnesses of a neighbor who fed the shop cat. He did not ask for more than she was willing to give. When she mentioned, in passing, a childhood fear of being watched, he did not linger on the word watched. He simply nodded and ordered her another cup of tea without comment. One afternoon, the world shifted in a headline. Sophie was stacking new arrivals when a customer, blowing in with the breeze, mentioned a gala at the Hayes Medical Group, a philanthropic night spotlighting donors and doctors alike. There was a glossy photograph, they said, showing Dr. Daniel Hayes standing beside a sculpted donor, smiling like someone made of careful money. The mention clipped the string that held Sophie's composure. A week later, a tabloid link did the rest. She had avoided headlines for most of her life, but the internet saw no such discretion. A friend teased her, sending a screenshot of Daniel in a lustrous suit, an article noting the size of a donation, another mentioning his ownership of the clinic's new wing. Her stomach flipped, a small stone dropping into her chest. It was not the revelation of money itself that did it. People could have wealth and still be kind. She had seen both. It was the sudden reminder of where he stood in a world that measured people by the currency they could deploy. It was the fear that she would be mistaken for someone looking for profit rather than presence. After that, she began to make herself smaller again. She avoided the coffee shop in the mornings. She took different routes home. The bookstore felt like a fortress. She clung to it. Daniel noticed. He was not blind to the way she receded. He had seen retraction before, objects and people retreating to safety, as if the hurt of being exposed might be softened by thin walls. He felt an old, familiar ache, the knowledge that people could confuse his means for a reason to be wary. He had spent years proving his humanity to people who saw him only as a balance sheet. He also felt the bluntest human response to the idea of someone smaller finding refuge. He wanted to be steady for her, but he also feared being the solution she had not asked for. He did not want to sweep into her life like a crisis dressed up as a rescue. That was the exact type of man who had once taken advantage of what he could offer. Daniel had been loved for a bank statement before, not for the person he was. He knew the bitterness that followed. So he did what he had vowed in that first suspicion-laden consultation. He stepped back. He gave space, but he did not abandon being there. He sent a text once, simple, professional, asking if she'd received the lab results. She did not reply. He left a book on the counter at her store with a small note. Nothing expected, just a reading.
She found it folded between 2 pages and sat on the floor of the storeroom to read it, feeling ridiculous and warmed and furious all at once. A month later, at a neighborhood book fair, spotted among the chatter and the pile of bargain bins, Sophie let herself be led into a tent where a local author read a passage. Daniel was there, not as a show, but as a person who had tacked a small sticky note on his calendar to remember the event. He was standing the same distance from her as always, a presence that did not demand. When the crowd thinned, he found her at the back, hands clasped around a paper cup.
Book fairs are more fun when you're not pretending you're only here for the coffee, he said, because it was the sort of trivial comment that made room for ordinary companionship. She smiled, an honest line that surprised both of them. In that moment, he saw her as she was, without a filter, open mouth, slightly flushed cheeks, the scars of nervous habits at the edge of her nails. He felt something tighten and then untangle in him. The desire to protect moved gently into the desire to know. They walked out together, not speaking of money or status. For once, the world was simply two people who liked certain novels and who could go 2 blocks without pretending the city had not been built to measure them. But Sophie had not unlearned her reflexes. The world had taught her to assume the worst. One evening, walking home from the shop in a rain that made the sidewalks gleam, she thought she saw him across the street entering a sleek black car. She turned away suddenly, her chest curdling with the idea that this was all a story already written. The poor woman and the wealthy man. An easy plot for people who like to solve problems with checks and captions. She told herself to stop paying attention. It was childish, she decided. She had no right to draw conclusions. Yet the danger of her life was that it had been small for so long, and smallness becomes a habit. When someone larger than your life begins to enter your margins, you either pull the margins tightly or you let the person step in. Sophie had been schooled in the first option. Pulling in felt safer. And then the city returned to its regular rhythm. Overdue books, a child asking for a fairy tale recommendation, a patron who left a coin and a note praising the quiet of the place. It was a world that functioned in increments, a dollar here, a smile there. Daniel moved quietly through it as an occasional punctuation mark, never a full stop. 2 weeks after the tabloids, she received an envelope slipped beneath the bookstore door. Inside was a small photograph of Daniel at the clinic in a candid, unstaged moment, him kneeling to tie the shoe of an elderly woman. The note on the back read simply, "For when you think people with means aren't kind." She almost returned it to his office, scrawling "no thank you" across the photograph, but she didn't. She put it on a shelf behind the register, and sometimes, in the quiet half hour before closing, she caught herself looking at it and feeling the most dangerous thing: hope. There is an ease to hope that is deceptive. It lingers like a lit candle in a drafty room. You believe in its glow until a gust knocks it flat. Sophie lived with the candle lit, because candles were cheaper and quieter than fireworks. They fit in the palm of a hand and could be carried to work, to home, to the small safe bed she kept with thrift store sheets. On a Tuesday in late autumn, she left the bookstore with a box of returned titles and the thought of making soup. She hugged the box to her chest, the paper edges biting her fingers. The sun had gone early, and the city smelled of wet pavement. For once she had not planned to meet anyone. She was content with the ordinary ritual of heading home, making soup, and letting the evening settle. The crosswalk light blinked. She moved with the rhythm of commuters, their faces a blur of business and exhaustion. A delivery truck idled at the curb, engine purring. She took a step into the street, counting like a person with long practice at avoiding collisions. She was 3 steps from the curb when the world telescoped into bright noise. The sharp hiss of brakes, a horn that sounded like fear, the sudden, unexpected tilt of her legs. There was a spinning sensation, like being rolled in a tumble of loud thoughts. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs, and the box slipped, sending books scattering like startled birds. She couldn't breathe for the small hollow it put in her chest. The sidewalk swam in a wash of headlights and a dozen faces folding into concern. She tried to take another step, and her knees betrayed her. The sky narrowed into a rectangle of gray. A man's voice shouted her name, a sound she knew instantly as not just a call, but an ownership of attention. Panic is an animal that sharpens everything. Cold found its way into her hands, and her pulse sang a high, panicked tune. The street leaned, then pulled at her with a force that felt both foreign and intimate. When she reached the edge of consciousness, fragments came into focus. The solid weight of someone's hand steadying her back, a murmured apology, the flash of a badge. She smelled antiseptic and rain, an odd mixture that loosened time around the edges. Her vision slit, then dimmed. I woke to a ceiling I could not name at first, white and not hospital white, more a kind of suspended light. A woman's voice spoke too close to her ear, soft and efficient. Memories tangled, the street, the box, the horn, the fall. Her throat tasted of metal regret. The world was muffled, as if she were lying at the bottom of something deep. A figure moved in the corner of my eye, tall, steady. My brain lagged, trying to give him a name. For a strung second, she thought I was back at the clinic, and then the realization landed like a hand. Daniel. He was there, not as a shadow, but as a real, breathing presence at the edge of the bed, one hand wrapped around a paper cup, the other folded into his jacket. He looked as though he had been carved of composed elements, hair tidy, suit sleeves impeccable even at the cuff, the very image of someone who never let the world dishevel him. Her first reaction was disorientation. Had he followed her? Had he seen her fall? She tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but her voice was thin and betrayed the immediate, fragile truth. She had been led by the city into danger, and someone had been near enough to catch. He saw the flicker of that thought cross her face. The look that crossed his was not one of accusation. It was quiet and immediate, a doctor's calm with something else threaded through it, relief, sharper than his professional composure would normally allow. "You're awake?" he said, which was the kind of understatement people used when they were trying to keep both themselves and the other person from panicking. "You were found on the curb. EMTs called it in." Her throat worked. "I don't remember." "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to remember." The world ordered itself in small, careful statements, each one a tether. Nurses moved in and out like soft tides, offering water, a blanket. A man in a fluorescent vest, an EMT with a face already creased by long shifts, offered a neutral assessment that softened into discreet kindness when he recognized the tension in Sophie's expression. "Hypoglycemia," he said, a word Sophie had heard like a distant tide. "Dehydration, stress compounding. You're going to be fine, Miss Bennett." He was being kind. He was watching her like someone had set her fragile thing on a display case, and he would do nothing to make it fracture more. Daniel stayed at the bedside, not taking over, not making the scene about him. There was a curated distance in his posture that kept the space safe, a way of being present without pressure. When the medic left and the room settled into a hush, Daniel lowered himself into a plastic chair with the unwilling grace of someone who had not planned to sit. His eyes, normally practical and assessing in the way of doctors, softened when he looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the most oddly human thing he'd said in weeks. I wasn't following you." He paused, an admission that was both simple and necessary. "I was at the clinic when one of our nurses recognized you at the corner. She called in an alert. I came as soon as I could." Sophie's hands found each other, fingers curling into the hems of her gown. She felt both small and fiercely exposed, as if every seam of her life could be read by the way she folded. "I didn't mean to be." She groped for a word that wouldn't make her sound absurd, vulnerable, pathetic. "I didn't mean to make you. You didn't make me anything," he interrupted, gently. He had the reflex of someone who corrected misimpressions without blame. "You were hurt. I came because—" He stopped, searching for the right sentence. Instead, he reached for his simpler truth. "Because I wanted to make sure you were okay." There it was, the exactness of his motive, stripped of the gilding she feared. No grand offers of rescue, no declarations of entanglement, just a human response to someone in need. His honesty, offered in that plain way, cut through the tissue of assumptions she'd built to protect herself. Relief arrived like a wave. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. It was small, but it was honest. And in that soft hour, with city noise a distant murmur, and the hum of machines a steady lullaby, something shifted. Sophie allowed herself to accept being cared for without instantly labeling the act. She let him be present without accusing him of being the sum of his bank account. She let him be a person who could be kind and not merely a symbol. In the corner of the room, her phone blinked with messages she ignored. A nurse drew shade across the window and offered toast and broth. Outside, world events continued to unfold. Inside, the truth between them had uncoiled a little. She had fallen. He had been there. But from the periphery of her thought came a familiar, prickly reminder, an aftertaste of fear. The fear that being helped would be misread. The fear that his staying would be construed as a favor and her acceptance as a debt. Daniel read the look on her face and closed his mouth. He had been careful for weeks. He would be careful now. He would not allow his presence to be used as shorthand for ownership. He would not let his means become a currency for affection. He would let her make the choice, and until then he would be steady without presuming. The nurse adjusted the blanket and stepped out, closing the door with the soft click that hospitals make when they fold private grief into the hallway's noise. For a suspended second, the room belonged to the two of them, and no one else. Sophie tested the edges of her voice, small as a moth. "Why did you stay?" she asked.
He considered the question with the flat assessment of a clinician, then with the secretive tenderness he saved for truths that were not work. "Because I didn't want you to feel abandoned," he said. "Because someone did that to me once, and I promised not to be the reason it happened to someone else." The words came like a confession, not dramatic, but true. Daniel had been on the receiving end of relationships that had used him as a scaffold, people who loved the life he could construct rather than the one who actually lived within it. That history made him cautious. It made him want to ensure that if he offered shelter, it was because shelter was needed, not because it would buy affection. Sophie's breath hitched. "You could have left," she murmured. "You didn't have to be here." "I wanted to be," he said.
Not because he paused. Not because I see a story, because I see you. The simplest sentence in the world, but it landed with the force of a small truth, the kind that settles into the shape of a life. Sophie felt it brush against the scar tissue of old rejections, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't pull away. Outside, something shifted. The city hummed. Inside a hospital room that smelled of lemon disinfectant and the faint trace of her own perfume, a woman who had always been taught to be small let herself be seen, and a man who had learned to keep his heart behind clear glass chose to sit nearby and not reach for the plate of rescue. Her hands found his in a gesture neither rushed nor scripted. It was an acceptance more than a vow, a small human contact that said she was not asking for a quid pro quo. He returned the pressure with a deliberate gentleness that did not attempt to engulf her. They did not speak of dating rules or power imbalances in that dim hour. They did not make plans. They simply existed together in a space where both of them, in different ways, had been broken and had chosen, for the moment, to be whole enough to sit. If this was the end of the story, it would be a modest one. But life and story are not tidy things. As the city exhaled and the nurse checked the monitor, a small, inevitable truth remained. Proximity did not equal permission. Outside in the corridor, the world resumed its endless business. Sophie closed her eyes and slept a shallow, relieved sleep. Daniel signed a few forms and sat in the chair beside the bed, his suit slightly creased and his hands folded, as if he had learned to wait in the precise way of someone who had been disappointed enough times to know how to be patient. When she woke again, the light had shifted. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that remembered warmth. A doctor came by for a quick check. He asked questions in that brisk language doctors used to stitch narrative back together. "How are you feeling? Do you have anyone you'd like us to call? Are you able to get home?" Sophie thought of the safe harbor of her bookstore, the small stability of soup and a couch. She felt the lingering tremor of embarrassment, but also something else, a curiosity that was new and alarming. She had been taught to be small and to take what came without asking for more, but she felt something else now, like a bud pushing through concrete. Daniel watched as she considered. He had already made the practical calls without making them about himself, arranging a cab, checking that she would have a friend to wait with her until she could get home. He kept it procedural. He kept it free of implication. When she finally rose, dressed in borrowed jeans and a long sweater, she felt the city on her like an expectation. She gathered her coat and her scattered pride and made for the door. Daniel stood with her, a pillar of steady quiet. For a long moment, he said nothing.
She looked at him and saw in the set of his mouth a restraint like armor. "Take care," he said finally. And it was what anyone would say to anyone leaving a hospital. But he added, almost as an afterthought, "If you ever want someone to check in, no pressure. Call the clinic." Sophie found herself smiling, an honest and inexplicable thing. "Maybe," she echoed. As she walked down the corridor and into the late sun, she felt watched and not watched, noticed and not owned. The city swallowed her again, and for a while she believed she had returned to the small and ordinary cadence of her life. But there was a trace now, faint and luminous, like a thread that would be tugged on later. She did not know then that every small kindness had a weight. She did not know the ways the world would test whether the promise to stay present could survive a headline, a misinterpreted photograph, the restless curiosity of neighbors and friends. She only knew that she had been seen at a moment she had feared most, and that someone had chosen to be the kind of person who remained. The days that followed were stitched together by small, ordinary stitches: inventory sheets, the rain-slick pavement, the bookstore's cat curling on a pile of unsold romances. Daniel did not overwhelm her life. He interleaved. An email asking if she'd received a book he thought she'd like, a message asking about her health, a careful appearance at a book signing that he might simply have attended because he loved the writer. His pauses were as meaningful as his gestures. He learned the tempo that did not force the heart, but offered company. And still, beneath the taut comfort of routine, Sophie felt something tautening, the fear that a life built of small favors could be misread. She had watched relationships in which love was a ledger, and she did not want to be anyone's credit. She had learned the economy of giving and being given to. She refused to be indebted for warmth. So she held back. She taught herself the rules anew. Accept kindness without surrender. Keep your life intact. Do not let gratitude be mistaken for purchase. That conservancy was working, fragile but practical, until a Saturday when a folded newspaper arrived on the doormat of the bookstore. It was a business section, glossy with photographs. The headline read, "Hayes Medical Group announces new endowment." The photograph beside it showed a gala crowd, Daniel included, shaking hands under bright lights. On the page, his smile was in the company of generous donors, the sort of photograph that measured influence in arm's-length gestures and ceremonial ribbon cuttings. The subhead mentioned a new wing, a donation, a name etched into glass. Sophie held the paper with the same distance she used to hold things that might bite. She felt the old reflex, shrink back, make yourself smaller. She remembered the words she had once said in a bright antiseptic room. I don't want pity. Don't make me a story.
She folded the paper and slid it into her apron pocket, feeling the weight of it like a bruise. She had not thought of money as threatening until it had appeared on a page like a spotlight. She had not thought of the role of wealth in turning a person into a story. But the headline was a reminder that the world wanted simplification. Narratives where people were products, where good deeds were transactions. She was not ready to be that story. She was not sure she wanted to be part of a narrative that could be reduced to an image. So she continued to keep her distance, to be practical, to accept the occasional kindness and nothing more. She watched him from the counter, seeing him interact with customers, noting his steady attention and his refusal to flaunt. He noticed her watching. He could have called her out, offered a grand explanation in the way wealthy men sometimes did, public declarations of intent. He did not. He waited, like a man who had learned that urgency was more often destructive than salvific. The city moved on. People bought and returned books. Rain came and went. The tabloid pieces fizzled like candles left in the wind. In the small, private ledger of their days, something else was being written. A map of mutual repair. She with her compacted self. He with his carefully hoarded vulnerabilities. And yet, as Sophie stacked the last of the day's returns, as she closed the register and turned the key, a small tremor of unease skipped across her ribs. There would be more moments to test them. Headlines would not be the only wild card. There would be missteps and misunderstandings, times when someone's intent would be misread. She pushed the thought away and locked the door with a hand that lingered on the handle, reluctant to leave the shop she had shaped into sanctuary. She turned toward home under a sky bruised with evening, the air tasting of damp leaves, and something that promised winter. 2 blocks from her apartment, the world moved too quickly for the quiet life she preferred. A group of teenagers jostled by, their laughter grainy with adolescent bravado. A cab splashed past. The city hummed with its usual, indifferent current. Sophie's legs carried her, steady, practiced. She had carried boxes of books, tall stacks of patience, smaller habits that kept the edges of her life tidy. She was thinking of soup and which shelf should tackle next week, when the street tilted and the world narrowed like a funnel. Everything went bright and quick, sounds sharpening to brittle edges. Her vision tunneled. Her knees felt like they were no longer part of her. The ground rose up and kissed her palms, then pulled away again. Hands closed around her forearms. A voice she recognized as a presence so constant it had become part of the city's furniture spoke her name like an anchor. The last thing she glimpsed before the world spun away was a familiar suit sleeve and a face hovering over her, eyes wide with a very personal alarm. Then the city folded into a blur, and Sophie surrendered to the edges of darkness with the odd, immediate peace of someone who has finally allowed herself to be caught. Hands closed around her forearms, firm, immediate, and a voice she had come to recognize as a presence in her life said her name like a rope thrown into water. Sophie's last coherent thought before the dark was the shape of a familiar suit sleeve, the idea that someone had bent the city toward her. And then nothing. Light, when it returned, was slow and polite.
It arrived at the edge of her vision and then filled it, warm and precise, like someone turning up a lamp so you could see the pieces again. Her ribs felt hollowed out, her limbs heavy with a tiredness that lived deeper than muscle. The ceiling above was a soft, anonymous weight. The smell was lemon and linen and safety. Hey. The voice was close. Not a clinician's clipped tone, but his, softened, careful. Daniel. She blinked until she could focus on him. The angle of his jaw, the way his hands were folded around something as if he were guarding air. He looked tired in a new way, worn from worry rather than from late nights at the hospital, and it made him, oddly, more human. You had me very worried, he said, and there was no performative drama in it, just simple truth. You fainted again. EMTs were great. They insisted we bring you in. Sophie's mind flared with a dozen small embarrassments, and then settled on a single practical worry. You weren't following me? She asked. The words were thinner than she intended. I wasn't, he said immediately. At least not then. I was nearby, at the clinic, and one of the nurses saw it happen. I came as soon as I could. He paused, searching something in her face. I'm sorry if it felt like intrusion. She considered how to answer without sounding accusing, and without sounding grateful in a way that felt owed. Instead, she let out a small, brittle laugh. I don't know why I keep passing out. That's what we'll figure out, he said. But you're awake, and you're here. That's good. He folded his hands into each other, as if to keep them still. Can I stay, or would you rather I leave? The question was ordinary and enormous at once. There it was, the simple offering of choice that had threaded through everything he'd done since the first appointment. He could have made assumptions, filled the silence with his preferences. He did not. He asked. Sophie considered the trajectory of the last months. The paper gown, the tremor of her hands in that antiseptic room, the way she'd learned to live in the margins. She thought of the photograph left under her door, of the headline that had made her small again, of the quiet visits and the book left on her counter. She thought of the way his presence had never felt like purchase.
Stay, she said finally, because she wanted to test whether she could accept a kindness without feeling bought. But not because you owe me. I wouldn't stay out of obligation, he answered, and there was a steadiness to the words that settled something else inside her. I'm here because I want to know you. If you ever feel uncomfortable, tell me, and I'll go. The air in the room thinned into a different texture, the one shared by two people who were speaking honestly about small things that could become large. He stayed. She slept a measured, shallow sleep, with his silhouette a quiet promise in the corner. When she woke again, fully, the hospital room had softened into afternoon. A stray sunbeam painted the foot of the bed with warmth. She could tell she was coherent because she noticed details, the faint chip in the curtain rail, the exact way the blanket folded at her knees. Daniel was still there, his chair a little closer, his suit jacket draped over the back, as if the act of removing it made him inhabit the space more humbly. She surprised herself by asking a simple question first. Why do you do it? Why stay? He looked at her like a man considering something he'd kept folded for too long. For a brief moment, she saw the professional mask slip, not in a way that broke trust, but in a way that made him more available. Because once I was the person who left, he said. I was left by someone who preferred the things money could give, rather than the person I was. I promised myself I wouldn't be a reason anyone felt abandoned. I know what that feels like. I didn't want it to happen to you. Even as he said it, he guarded the next word. But I have to be honest, he added, and there was a tremor in his voice she had never heard in the clinic. This isn't just about duty. Sophie's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with her earlier faint. She'd rehearsed responses in the back of her head 100 times, barbed politeness, measured distance, any defense that would keep her from being misread. Those rehearsals dissolved under the truth of his face, a man who looked older for the lessons he'd been forced to learn, but sincere. What is it, then? She asked. He swallowed. The next admission came like someone setting a fragile object down and not rushing away. I want you, he said simply. The words were neither theatrical nor flashy. They were an admission, a confession in its strictest sense, an overturning of a part of himself he had carefully held private. I've wanted to be near you for weeks, not because I can write a check and fix things, not because I want to be a headline, because when I look at you, I don't see a story to be told. I see you. Sophie felt the room tilt. The confession hit a place she'd learned to protect, the ledger where affection and obligation had once been scored and found wanting. Her first reaction, reflexive and sharp, was to recoil.
The power imbalance was a line she'd been taught never to cross. A wealthy doctor declaring desire to a vulnerable woman in a hospital bed could be read as anything but honest. "Daniel," she began, meaning to name the danger. She groped for a phrase that would be both honest and protective. "You're the chief doctor. You have influence. I can't—" Her voice broke on the word influence, the currency of it all. He raised his hand in a small, deliberate gesture. "I know," he said, "and I am not blind to that. That's why I'm telling you this now, when you're awake, when you can answer me. I will not use my position. I will not let money be the yardstick of our relationship. I'm willing to step back if you want me to. I'm willing to accept boundaries you set. I won't force you. I won't let anyone say I made you feel indebted." He was careful in a way that felt like a second fingerprint, the manner that acknowledged the imbalance and refused to hide from it. He was offering not grand gestures, but contractless consent, an agreement to honor her agency above his wants. Sophie watched him as he spoke, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to measure someone by small, consistent things, instead of by the glaring top line of a bank account. She remembered the little blue note slipped under the register, the book left for her to find, the way he'd turned up at a reading simply because he liked the author. She thought of the photograph of him tying an old woman's shoe and felt something like a warm shock of recognition. Her mind was loud with reasons to be cautious. And yet there was another thread, tender and insistently truthful. A memory of the first consultation when he'd promised not to turn her into a cautionary tale. The way he'd listened without panicking. The hand at her bedside that had not tried to claim her as a reward. "What do you want?" she asked finally. She was asking for clarity as much as she was asking permission from herself. He closed his eyes as if counting off an inventory. When he opened them, they were honest and bare. "I want to get to know you," he said. "I want to see if what I feel can be built without leverage. I'm not asking you to accept everything at once. I'm asking if you'd let me try, with your rules and your timing. If at any point you feel pressured, say so and I'll step back. If you say no, I will accept that." It was not a flourish. It was a proposition made of small, negotiable parts. It left space between them for dignity. Sophie thought of dignity like a fragile object. She'd held it in thrift store hands for years. To accept a life that might tilt that object was terrifying. But she also thought of another quiet thing she'd learned in the pages she shelved and reshelved, that risk and safety often lived in the same sentence. She could fold the world smaller and preserve what she had, or she could allow a cautious entrance and risk being misread or loved. "Let me be very clear," she said, the plainness in her voice a rule she gave herself. "You do not get to decide what I owe. You do not get to use your title or your money to make this easier for me. If we try this, it's because both of us want it, not because you can buy my gratitude." Daniel's face softened into relief. "I promise," he said. "No gifts you don't want, no favors that feel like obligations. We set the pace, we agree the rules, and if at any point you ask me to step away, I will." Sophie let the words sit between them like a treaty. She felt small impatience with the melodrama of romantic stories that solved everything with declarations. She was not built for fireworks. She needed normalities, grocery runs, book recommendations, a person who answered texts when they said they would. "Okay," she said, surprising herself. "We start small. Coffee, books, no gala photos." He laughed, a short, relieved sound, and then reached for her hand, not because he thought he owned it, but because their fingers fit, and because it felt like an acceptable mutual thing to do. "Coffee," he repeated. "Books, no gala photos." They made a plan that was painfully ordinary. He would respect her space. She would tell him when she felt overwhelmed. They would meet in public places that felt safe, and in the clinic only when necessary and strictly professional. The rules were careful, and that's what made them possible. Recovery afterward felt like learning a new language. There were doctor's appointments, gentle check-ins, and an awkward first coffee.